Have you ever used the phrase being mullered? It's not a nice phrase. It can mean feeling drunk, or it can mean to be beaten. Now, no one really knows where the word came from, but some speculate it might have come from the incident with Thomas Briggs and how his murder on the 9:45 train from Fenchurch rocked the UK and beyond. The 9th of July 1864 was a Saturday. It was a pleasant, warm summer's day with a nip in the evening air, enough to grab your coat. 69-year-old Thomas Briggs was waiting for his evening train. He was a middle-class banker and was heading home after a lovely evening dinner with his niece and her husband. He wasn't the most wealthiest of men, but was by no means shy of a few pence. The 9:45 train to Hackney arrived on time, and Thomas settled into his first-class compartment. Like many trains at the time, the compartment was part of a rake of other compartments and did not have a corridor in between them or connecting them to the rest of the train. This meant that if a passenger wanted to leave the carriage, they were unable to do so safely unless the train was stopped. It was assumed that Thomas took the chair nearest the carriage door, and he leant against the glass, relaxed and contented. When the train arrived at 10 p.m. at Hackney, Hart Veneres and Sidney Jones would open the carriage where Thomas had entered, intending to take the first-class carriage. Instead of finding the sleeping gentleman, they found his seat covered in blood and splattered around the carriage, and a bag, hat and cane on the floor, with Thomas nowhere to be seen. Around the time the two men were making their shocking discovery, Alfred Eakin, a train driver on the down line, saw a strange object on the side of the tracks. He carefully stopped his engine and was shocked to discover it was a man. The man had severe injuries to his head, but amazingly, he was still alive. Alfred quickly gathered a group of men and helped carry the poor man off the tracks and into the Mitford Castle public house. The man was placed in a back room on a table and a surgeon was called for, but the surgeon could do little to help. The head wounds were too great. From letters the man carried, he was quickly identified and his family took him home. But despite everyone's best efforts, Thomas passed on Sunday night, having never regained consciousness, leaving behind a wife and children. The police concluded pretty quickly that foul play was afoot, but what sensationalised it was that it had taken place in a railway carriage. To many people, railways were new, scary, noisy things, and the engines had a tendency to explode. Railway opposers loved to relish and publicise railway failings, and the murder of a gentleman in a first-class compartment was perfect kindling to start the flame of unease amongst doubters. If a first-class upstanding citizen was not safe, then who was? The police got straight to work. Inspector Richard Tanner took up the job of leading the case and started by looking at the carriage. The carriage had been moved into a shed and out of the sight of onlookers. This was still fairly early days in policing and forensics were unheard of, so Richard had very little to go on. But Richard was clever. In fact, he was one of the cleverest and quick-witted men on the force. From the blood spatter, he managed to establish where Thomas was sitting when he was attacked, and even that his head was leaning on the window. The detective concluded that Thomas was most likely sleeping when he was attacked. Satisfied the carriage would yield no other secrets, focus was drawn to Thomas himself. Thomas was examined carefully. His shirt collar was undone, but thanks to testimony from Thomas's niece, who had seen him just a half an hour before, the police noted that his golden spectacles, golden pocket watch, and chain were missing. A link of the chain was still attached to his waistcoat, indicating that it had been forcibly removed. The man had no enemies, and nothing else that would link any other motive to kill him other than robbery. The hat that was found in the carriage was presumed to be Thomas's, but Thomas's niece and his family advised that they had never seen that hat before. Finally, the police had some form of lead. If the hat wasn't Thomas's, then it had to be the killer. With no identifying marks on the hat, the police knew that they needed help, so they decided to go to the public and offered a £100 reward, with the government and Thomas's bank adding contributions. Soon the amount had reached over £300, equivalent to a rather large salary. While the public was focused on the hat's owner and the handsome reward, the police turned their attention to the pocket watch and chain. Their first port of call was the pawnbrokers. With the case being so high profile, they knew that the thief would want rid of it quick, and there was no better way than a pawnbroker. Unlike today, people can trade in almost anything of value for cash with no questions asked, with gold and silver being the most usually pawned. Many jewellers would have a pawn trade on the side. The most prolific pawnbrokers were on Cheapside, so the police went door to door asking the owners if they'd been offered a watch and a broken chain. One jeweller named John Deaf came forward, and that he had taken receipt of a broken chain on the Monday after the robbery. Like many others, he didn't have any record of the man's name, but he did give a description. He appeared to have a German accent, and he was young. The young man exchanged the chain only and bought other items, including a ring. The ring was placed in a ring box bearing the jeweller's name, but without a name or a proper description, the trail went cold. The press, though, were far from done. Nearly every day the press focused on the investigation, with the papers now travelling the breadth of the country via train. Nearly everyone not only heard about it, but also had something to say. It could be considered as one of the first ever viral news stories of the Victorian era, with the newspaper being the social media medium providing the latest tidbits. 9 days after the trail fell cold, a local cabman called Jonathan Matthews walked into the police station and placed a ring box on the counter. Not only did he claim to have information that would blow the case wide open, but he also claimed to know the culprit. Franz Muller was a lodger at Matthews' home, and the pair had known each other for a few years, even as far as falling in love and making Matthews' daughter his fiancée. Franz had come from Germany and was a tailor by trade. He was only 24, but seemed to have laid his roots and his career was promising. Matthews claimed that on Monday night after the crime, Franz came home with a ring box bearing the name of John Jeff's Jewellers and gave it to one of his children, and that the hat found in the carriage did belong to Muller, as Matthews himself purchased the hat especially for him. Matthews produced a photograph of Franz, and the jeweller confirmed it was him that came in on that fateful Monday. But there was a bit of a problem. Franz had packed up and left 4 days prior and was currently on the way to the Americas on a heavy cargo ship. Tanner knew exactly what to do and booked him, several other officers, and Deaf and Matthews on a much faster steamer with the hope of catching up with the suspect. The race was on. Tanner's steamship was much faster of the two ships, and it arrived in New York on August the 5th. The news of the crime and the race had travelled with him, and soon the whole city was awash with scandal, and that there was a known killer that was sailing to their shores. In fact, the only people that had not known of the police's arrival was Franz and the crew of the slower cargo ship, as there was no radio or communication other than a few flag semaphores and Morse code signalling. After enjoying a pleasant 2.5 weeks in the town, Tanner, flanked by several other officers, waited as the steamer pulled into the harbour. Behind them, thousands of people gathered to watch the arrest. Tanner boarded the ship and found Muller in his compartment. Muller was led away in handcuffs to the jail, where Tanner arranged an identity parade, and Deaf picked him out as the person who sold him the chain, and Muller was arrested. After a search of Muller's belongings, a hat and a pocket watch was discovered. The top hat had been crudely cut down and sewn together, and the pocket watch was identified as Thomas's by the maker's mark. Having touched US soil, Muller was at the mercy of the US courts, and he fought hard against being extradited to the UK for trial. Eventually, the US courts decided that Muller must stand trial for his crimes in the country it happened, and he arrived back in the UK on the 17th of September. The trial began on the 24th of October. It was held at the Old Bailey, London's most famous criminal court, and it was rather different to how the courts proceed today. Today's court proceedings are much more organised. For example, once the jury has been sworn in, the prosecution will put up its case first, call witnesses, and then close its case, with the defence following the same procedure. In Victorian times, there was no separate case for the defence. The prosecution would outline the charges, then call witnesses to help prove they are correct, and the defence's job would prove that this didn't happen under cross-examination. A lot of the evidence thrown up at court was circumstantial, but one of the witnesses claimed that Muller was with her around the time of the murder. This appeared to be an airtight alibi, but the prosecution brought up the lady's escorting dealings, and the evidence was considered unreliable due to the lady's credibility. Another grain of doubt was Jonathan Matthews. For a man who knew so much about Muller, why had he not come forward sooner? This case was everywhere, and for a cabman of London, surely he would have heard the mutterings of people, or at least seen a newspaper. Matthews simply replied that he had no interest in newspapers, but had heard about it once Muller had left. It was also worth mentioning that while Matthews had shown ignorance about the crime, he certainly didn't have the same dismissive attitude when it came to the reward money. Matthews was heavily in debt. Could he have framed Muller in order to get himself out of trouble? Muller tried everything, but after 3 days of court and 15 minutes of deliberations, the jury came back with a unanimous verdict: guilty. There was only one punishment for a crime as cruel as this, and I can only imagine how Muller was feeling when the judge asked the clerk to help him don the famous black coif on the top of his wig cap, knowing his fate was sealed, and signing the warrant with a fountain pen, traditionally breaking the nib so it may never write again. You shall hang by the neck until dead, and may God have mercy on your soul. Muller was taken down. There would be no appeals, no second chances. He knew this was it. In the first streams of light on the 14th of November 1864, over 50,000 people made their way to the square outside Newgate Prison near the Old Bailey. Inside the condemned cell, Muller was waking up to his last day on earth. He met with the chaplain and conversed in German. At the tolling of the bell, the guard strapped Muller's hands behind him and walked him out of the cell into the daylight. He was calm and resigned to his fate. When all was ready, the crowd silenced. The silence only broken by the boom of the trapdoor and the creak of a lever. As with all prisoners, Muller was buried later that day in Newgate Prison in an unmarked grave. The prison was eventually torn down and the Old Bailey sits upon it, so it's very possible that Muller is still there. Thomas Briggs was given a more lavish send-off, and he is buried at Hackney New Gravel Pit Chapel. The burial ground is still there, however sadly it has been closed off to the public and has since become overgrown. Even though the case was concluded, the railway still had a lot to do to gain back public confidence, and there was 2 changes that they implemented on Thomas's death. The first was to push a redesign of new stock with interconnecting corridors. This made sense on both a practical and safety view. Having the train have a continuous corridor would allow for people to move more freely, to whatever part of the train that they please. This opened up facilities such as toilets and even the provisions of food. It also made sense on a safety aspect. If there was an incident, let's say for example a fire, people would naturally navigate to the end or the front of the train. It's pure instinct, which is why longer vehicles, such as buses and planes, have rear exits through the back, either by a window or a door. It's also why the doors are situated specifically at either end of a coach. It's regulation that the doors on either end of the train must remain unlocked. If it's not working, then that carriage must not be put on the end of a train. The other feature implemented is a feature that we've all seen but rarely used: the communication cord. Modern day communication cords are all electrical and indicates to the driver or the guard of a problem, and the train can be stopped instantly for the situation to be dealt with. But what if you can't communicate with the driver? Let's say the driver was in a Class 37 or a steam locomotive where the crew are separated by a tender. You couldn't have a phone, and bells and whistles would get lost on the noisy footplate or in the diesel's roar. For this example, I'm going to look at what I know best, a Mark I coach. At the end of the carriage, just above the door near the guttering, you may see this bit of kit. Depending on the guard and the railway, this is known as a flag or a butterfly. For the next part, you need to know a little bit about the vacuumed braking system. There's a lot to it, but I'm going to simplify. In short, there is a pipe that goes from the engine all the way down the train. It is connected to any carriages it is pulling, and at the end is put on a sealed plate. When a guard or driver uses the term to create a vacuum, the engine draws air out of the pipe, and in turn, through a rather clever connection of cylinders, the brakes along the train are released. When you hear the term continuously fitted, this is what they're referring to. The idea that if there is a separation of the coaches, for example if a buckeye fails, then the coaches separate, the hoses break away and air rushes into the system, stopping not only the train and the crew, but the affected coach as well. It's very clever and saves any danger of leaving a coach behind or a coach running into the train. Destroying the vacuum can also be useful when working under coaches, coupling or uncoupling, as it's a good safety feature to ensure nothing goes anywhere. Now back to that communication cord. The moment it is pulled on, the flag goes up. The raising of the flag allows a little air to seep into the braking system. It's not a lot, but it's enough to cause a bit of a drag for the crew to notice. Now the guard, who has a pressure gauge in the cab, can also see that drop in pressure and can flag the train down to stop. It is then up to the guard to see what the problem is. The guard must walk out of the train looking for the flag. Once it is found, the guard can enter the carriage to find and deal with the problem, aided by the crew if required. Once the guard has dealt with the issue, they must exit by the same door and then push the butterfly back. It's not a problem in station, but if they're in the middle of nowhere, then that poor guard has a near enough 10-foot climb to push that little bugger back. Only then the guard is happy, then the train has permission to move again. Communication cords are lifesavers, but many have been attempted to abuse them. All communication cords carry hefty fines or even arrests if they are misused, and can cause serious delays, so they must only be used in the strictest of emergencies. All railway stock must carry working communications cords, so just because it's older, you must never assume it doesn't work. There is, of course, the human factor in this tale. Because of one man's greed, a family lost a loving father and a husband. Although Thomas never saw it, his death led to many hundreds more being saved, thanks to communication cords and corridors. There are also still memorials to Thomas. If you look close enough, you can still find them. There is a plaque near to the spot where he died, and the pub was up until 2013 was still standing, with the back room still as it was the night that Thomas was carried in. The pub, which was renamed to Muller and Briggs, was demolished, and a new bar called the Italian Job took its place. Interestingly though, if you head to this bar and have a look at the wall on the back stairs, there among the photos of old London sits the infamous photo of Franz Muller, forever immortalised as the railway murderer.